Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Tuesday, February 25th. I had to look there for a minute. And for a change, I'll do the thing I'm supposed to do at the beginning of every one of these, which is tell you if you're watching the video, subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you're listening on one of your podcast apps, subscribe to this podcast. You can subscribe on Apple, iTunes, Stitcher, Google, all of them. It's on all of them. So just about all of them. There's none that I know of that it's not. And I want to talk today a little bit about federal spending, the federal budget, because most people, in my opinion, have no idea exactly what the government spends and what they spends money on. I think people have all kinds of ideas, not so much of what do they spend money on, but what the proportions are. So and I'll give you an example. As much as I love Rand Paul, I love his Festivus airing of grievances about federal spending. But when you hear something like the federal government spent $600 million to study gender awareness in warthogs, and you go, oh my God, I can't believe it. No wonder we're going broke. I mean, just to put that, I just made that up. I just made it up, but it's very likely that they did spend hundreds of millions of dollars studying gender awareness in warthogs. It wouldn't surprise me if they did. It shouldn't surprise you. But if it was $600 million, just to put things in perspective, federal spending was almost $7 trillion last year. So it's projected to be 7 trillion this year. So maybe we'll use this year's projected numbers. It was 6.8 last year. Nice, even 7 trillion this year. And as we know, a billion is 1,000 million, and a trillion is 1,000 billion. So a trillion is therefore a million. Okay. So if the government spends $600 million on something, even though that's a ridiculous amount of money, it's 600 out of a million. Okay. So obviously it's a tiny little rounding error fraction of the budget. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be cut. I'm just saying when you hear some of these numbers roll by you, just keep that 7 trillion, that 7 million number in your head so that you don't get distracted with where really where most of the money goes. So I thought I would do an episode and just run through the numbers from a very high level. And I don't know if this is going to put you to sleep or if it's going to be eye-opening. You tell me in comments and on the YouTube or on the show notes page for the podcast whether you like this. I'd like to do one on Social Security. I think I will do that one separately, but we'll talk about that a little bit today. So if the government's going to spend $7 trillion on it this year, fiscal year 2025, which began last October, by the way. So the government's first thing you should know is the government's fiscal year starts in October 1st of the year before. So fiscal year 2025 will run from October 1st, 2024 through September 30th, 2025. And in that time, they're going to spend $7 trillion. And I have news for you for all the people who think they're doing mic drops on libertarians when they say, I guess I won't see you driving on the government roads. Government roads are not even a rounding error. They won't, they don't even qualify for a blip in federal spending. So most of what the government spends money on is, the one word answer is welfare. Okay. Taking money from one person and giving it or spending it on another. And one way to kind of get your head around that is that and I'll use the numbers for 25 for this year, even though they're projected, they're not that far from last year, and they're nice and a little more even because we get to that nice, well, it's actually 5.1 trillion in revenues this year. They're going to spend 7 trillion. So they're going to have an almost $2 trillion deficit. The total deficit will actually be 1.865 trillion. So, okay, out of that 7 trillion, where does it go? Now, there's two categories you should know about right away. One of them is called mandatory spending, and the other is called discretionary spending. And the mandatory spending is the bulk of what the government spends money on. So they spend this year, mandatory spending will be 4 trillion out of that 7 trillion, 4.2 actually. Okay, so you could see that it's way more than half of the money spent by the government will be on mandatory spending. What is mandatory spending? It's all welfare. Now, I'm going to get the angry comments that Social Security is not a welfare program. Listen, I'll do a separate episode on why there is just no argument there, but let me just call it's a transfer program, okay? It's taking money from one person and giving it to another. And no, there is no trust fund with savings for all the money you gave before. That's all been spent. Every dollar we pay out of every paycheck is spent the minute the government gets it. And I'll do that separately. But you should know that. So in mandatory spending, we've got 1.4 trillion for Social Security, about 910 billion, so almost a trillion for Medicare. So those two make up what is supposed to be paid out of payroll taxes. So I made a few notes. So if we spend 2.4 trillion this year on just Social Security and Medicare, well, payroll taxes only collected 1.7 trillion. So even the money coming out of your check for Social Security and Medicare is nowhere near covering the amount of money that it costs to pay all the people that are collecting right now. Okay, so no money's being put away in a trust fund. That wasn't always the case, and I'll get to that a little later if I have time, or in the separate episode on Social Security and Medicare. And that's one thing when you hear people say, oh, only such a percentage pay the income tax. The income tax and the payroll tax are two different revenue streams. So the payroll tax only goes to Social Security and Medicare. And the income tax is separate. So as I said before, the government's going to spend 7 trillion this year. They're only going to collect 5 trillion in revenue. Okay. Half of that will come from the income tax, which is not your FICA. It's the extra money. And that's the part that most people, at least half the country, doesn't pay any income taxes when you subtract any federal benefits they get back. And, the top 20% pay 80% of the income tax or something like that. So that's one revenue stream, the income tax. Corporate tax is 530 billion. So together it's just about 3 trillion collected in income taxes, mostly on individuals, a little bit of that on the corporations. And then the other big revenue stream is the payroll tax. As I said, 1.7 trillion. Okay. And it goes towards paying 2.4 trillion in Social Security and Medicare. All right. And that makes up the bulk of mandatory spending, but not all of it. Okay, so out of that 4 trillion in mandatory spending, Social Security and Medicare about 2.4 billion. Then you have Medicaid, another big number at $812 billion. Now, here's the thing about Medicaid. Medicaid, what you see on the federal budget, it's only half of what's being spent. So for every dollar on that federal budget in Medicaid, another dollar is spent by the states. So that's an even bigger number than Medicare right now. It's really more like 1.6 trillion, but for the feds, it's only 800. And then you have a category called other mandatory. All right. And other mandatory is, other welfare programs. All the welfare, when you hear the word welfare, you think of like, the money that the government spends on housing for poor people, foods, food stamps actually is discretionary, but most of that other money. And that's considered mandatory. That's almost a trillion out of the 7 trillion. So the reason they call all this mandatory spending is that because of the existence of these programs, it's Congress isn't considered to be able to vote on how much money they appropriate for this. It's just automatic unless they change the Social Security Act or some of these rules about Medicare or other welfare programs. This money just has to be paid. There's no argument about it. Okay, so that's most of the budget. All right, so again, we're using 2025 numbers. So what's really interesting, oh, did I really say that? Is that discretionary spending out of that 7 trillion is only 1.8 trillion. And it's almost exactly, it's 1.848. And the projected deficit will be 1.865. So the entire discretionary budget is all going to just be borrowed. Okay. All of the money that was collected is going to go towards these so-called mandatory programs. So that should be enlightening to you. So, okay, out of 7 trillion, we got 1.8 going towards discretionary spending. And what's that? And part of this is not even really discretionary, but 859. So a little under half of it goes to defense, what we call defense, what I call offense or the empire, military spending. Now, some part of that is necessary. I would argue even in an anarcho-capitalist society without any government at all, that some defense spending would be necessary. But a small fraction of it is necessary. Most of it's a ripoff. I'll do a separate episode on that too. And even Trump is acknowledging that most of this spending is a ripoff. He wants to cut defense spending severely, but he's tying it to China and Russia cutting their spending, which is kind of ludicrous because China spends about a third of what the United States spends, and Russia spends about a tenth of what the United States spends, even while they're fighting all of NATO. So there's no reason not to cut this in half right now. A lot of it's just rip-offs by defense contractors and et cetera. And not to mention, we're warehousing 200,000 troops overseas doing basically nothing and hopefully never doing anything. So we could bring all those home. They're spending all their paychecks in foreign countries. So even though they shouldn't be employed at all, most of them, at least if we brought them back here, maybe put them on the southern border, they'd be spending their money in the United States. Not that that's good Keynesian fiscal stimulus, but I digress. So half of it goes to defense spending, which is about 12%. I'm not sorry, not half of it, but 859 billion. Then there's non-defense discretionary spending, which is 989 billion, almost a trillion. And I didn't do the percentage on this. I'm going to do it right now. So if you spend 989 divided by 7,000, that's 14%. So 14% of the money that the federal government spends is on the things that people think the federal government spends money on. Okay, all those programs, everything that Rand Paul posts about during Festivus, that's all out of that 14%. So 86% of the money gets spent on something else. So the roads, the last I checked, the roads might have been like 100 billion a year out of 7 million million. I'm sorry, out of 7,000 million, the roads were 100 million. So 1 out of 7,000, 100 out of 7,000, excuse me. So yeah, the roads are, they're bigger than like the gender awareness and warthogs, but probably, but like we wouldn't need the income tax to pay for the roads. Okay. Even the little bit we get on tariffs, comes from, and by the way, what money is going to be collected, what was collected on tariffs last year. And this isn't just tariffs, but all tariffs last year and all of those charges on your cable bill or your hotel bill, your cell phone, any federal taxes on gasoline or cigarette, all of it added up to $253 billion out of the total revenues of 5 trillion. So 253 billion out of 5,000 billion were all those taxes. All right. So when Trump goes on and on about all the money that, well, first of all, to replace the income tax with the tariffs, you could see that the tariffs would have to be like many iterations of the 3 trillion in imports we do. So ludicrous, right? Anyway, so this is where the money is going. And everything that Doge is doing, by the way, is all coming out of that 14% of overall spending. So even if it was all cut 100%, which Doge is by no means trying to do, the budget, we'd still be spending 86% of the budget. We'd still be hundreds of billions of dollars if you cut all non-defense discretionary spending. Okay, so you cut that 952 and you cut the military in half, we'd still be hundreds of billions, more than 500 billion deficits every year. And that's with the federal government doing nothing and cutting, other than welfare, basically, and cutting defense in half. So this brings us to the checks they want to send out. That's just pure vote buying. It's just more inflation. And when I say it's inflation, it's because those checks will be with borrowed money, because, as I just said, there's no scenario where they're not borrowing more money, no matter what Doge cuts, even if it cuts everything. And then they're going to spend money on top of what they cut. So they're going to actually not be cutting because they're spending that money, sending it to you and me, supposedly. And then they got to go out and, the way the government borrows money is it writes a bond and it's got to sell it. Well, who's been buying the bonds the government sells? The market buys some of them, but some portion gets bought by the Federal Reserve. That's why their balance sheet has gone from 4 trillion to, it went as high as 9 trillion at the peak of the COVID inflation. And now it's down to just under 7 trillion. Well, that's all money that the Federal Reserve just created out of thin air to buy government bonds. So that's what's called monetizing the debt. They just print money and buy the bonds, and that money goes into the banking system and the bank lends it out. Now, sometimes the bank socks it away in their own reserve accounts, something they never used to do before 2008. I've done a separate episode on that. But in any case, that's where rising prices come from. They tell you that inflation is defined as rising prices, but it's not. That's why I keep my 1999 paper dictionary in a desk drawer to my right, because when you look up inflation in that, it's the central bank creating new money and credit. That's what the definition of inflation is. Rising prices are a result of inflation, but they've been working on changing that definition for so long that now if you look online at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's reversed. They say that the rising prices are inflation, and then they have some little disclaimer like said to be caused by new money and credit. But when you think of the word inflate, it's a volume term. It's nothing to do with a rising level of something. It's the volume of something. That's why the word inflation actually means creating a new volume of money and credit, because some credit can be used as money. So I don't know. I'm thinking like this is probably a revelation for all you people that are still awake. This may be a revelation to you about what the government really spends the money on. So again, as long as you count Social Security and Medicare as welfare, even though we pay into it and all the money we pay in is spent the minute the government gets it, then, geez, almost 4 trillion of the 7 trillion goes to welfare. 1 trillion goes to interest on the debt. I didn't mention that 952 billion. So almost 1 trillion of that 7 trillion is just interest on the debt. That's just paying interest on deficits we ran before. I should say we. It's not we, that they ran before. Those of us who've done our best to vote against every single dime of spending and object to all of it and oppose the wars and oppose, the wars, by the way, are not a big contributor to the debt either. They do contribute, but really the standing army all over the world, like that's the bulk of defense spending. Like when they have a war, it only goes up like 100 billion out of the 859 billion they're going to spend. Now the Senate just voted to give them $150 billion increase. That'll make it a nice even trillion. Even though Trump says he wants to cut the military, the Senate wants to raise it over the ludicrous amount it already is. But if you notice, when the Afghanistan war ended, defense spending increased the next year. But they did have this about $100 billion, 120, $40 billion spending gap that they had to make up. And boy, oh boy, what came along? The Ukraine war, just in time to fill that little dip in spending that we would have seen from ending the Ukraine war. So it wasn't that convenient. So last set of bullet points, they're going to collect 5 trillion in revenues this year. They're going to spend 7 trillion. Out of the revenues they collect, 1.7 are payroll taxes. That's paid by everybody, about 15% of your paycheck. If you're working for somebody else, then your employer pays half of that. So you only pay 7.5, but you're really paying it because that's money they would spend on you. I own a business. I employ people. When I figure out a business plan, I just put down the whole 15% as the cost of employment. So, and I'm always trying to pay people more if I can and still remain profitable. So that's how business really works for those of you who have never owned one. You're always competing for better employees. Right now, it's hard to get good people. I pay them as much as I can afford and still turn some kind of a profit. And when I count the payroll tax, you see, like I have to pay the employee's whole hourly wage or salary plus 7.5%, really in New York State, 9.5% more than that, really 10% more than that in New York State with all the benefits that are mandated over what the paycheck is. Because I'm making up that other half that you're paying if you're an employee and only paying half of the Social Security. So that's all it costs. Anyway, 5 trillion in collected revenues, 1.7 is payroll taxes, 3 trillion is individual and corporate income tax, most of that individual, and then this little tiny bit is tariffs and cell phone taxes and gas taxes and all the rest. Okay, that's where they get the 5 trillion. They spend 7. Most of that's on taking money from one person, giving it to another. And then this other little part, 1.8 trillion, is split between 3 ways, almost evenly, between defense, everything else the government does, all the regulation and all that. That's about one third of the budget, and then interest is about a third of discretionary, one third of one third, and defense is one third of one third. So it's all, what you think the government is spending money on is all about, not even a third of the budget. 1.8 trillion out of 7. Let's do the little math here. 0.8 divided by 7. It's about a quarter. Okay. So a quarter of all federal spending is on defense and all the things you think it's on. And then the other 75% is basically taking money from one person and giving it to another. And, we could eliminate that whole thing and just let everybody keep their own money, cut defense at least in half. And now you're talking about a fraction of the federal budget. Defense was always the biggest part of every government budget up until the progressive era. And defense should be the largest part of our budget, and it should be way smaller than it is. Just as a perspective, the federal government is spending, and this is the last thing I'll say, and I said this in this recent article I wrote, the government is spending $7 trillion, and then the total amount of government spending is $11 trillion. That counts federal, state, and local spending. And that's about 40% of total GDP at 26.8. I'm going off memory here because I didn't write these down, but I'll link to this. So, of all the money, of all the wealth that we produce, and this includes government spending and GDP, which it should be subtracted, but 40% of it goes to government. The government spends 40%. So it's like if we were on an island with a bunch of people and I said, look, I'm going to make sure none of these other people steal your stuff. And I'll generally give you security. How much is it going to cost? Almost half of everything you make. You'd probably say no, depending on how capable you are, I guess. But again, the idea, when you read like Thomas Paine and he says, what's the purpose of government? It's to give up a small percentage of our property for preservation of the rest. A concept he got from John Locke, which said that the chief end of government, the chief purpose, is preservation of our property, our lives, liberties, and possessions. So no, we're spending 40%. It's ludicrous. And most of it is just a ripoff. It's just taking money from one person and giving it to another, the vast majority. And really, Trump is promising not to touch any of that. So, as radical as he may seem, everything he's talking about cutting comes out of that 25% of the budget that's discretionary. So I hope that this was interesting to you. I'll link to the Congressional Budget Office where I got these numbers. There's different versions of these numbers. The White House puts out their budget. Congress comes up with one. They all vary by very tiny amounts that don't make a difference, don't change any of the things that I said. Congressional Budget Office is supposed to be nonpartisan. So, at least it's not, directly political. So there it is. And the other thing I'll say is I have a link to this in my latest Substack article called Trump's Cuts Could Cause Some Necessary Economic Pain. You should subscribe to my Substack as well. Some of the information is behind a paywall. There's free articles there. Consider becoming a paid subscriber. It doesn't cost very much, and you get all sorts of interesting things that you don't get if you're a free subscriber. I try to keep the teasers for free subscribers interesting as well and worth subscribing. So I'll link to my Substack as well. That's at tommullen.substack.com, where you can find my latest article with a link to all these numbers and much more inside. And that'll do it for today. Next episode is episode 200. Give me some ideas on what you might like for me to do. If I don't get any good ideas, believe me, I won't come up with any myself. I'm terrible at marketing. So if you have an idea for the 200th episode, you tell me. And if enough of you tell me the same thing, then maybe we'll give it a shot. Thanks for watching.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.